Good evening. This is the Guilford, Connecticut Board of Education. It is Monday, February 7th. We are meeting tonight in a special meeting to discuss the proposed budget for the academic 2022-2023 academic year, brought to us by our superintendent, Dr. Paul Freeman. The agenda for tonight is focused entirely on a budget conversation and a potential vote to forward a budget to the Board of Finance. However, if we find as a board that we want and need more time to continue our discussion, considerations, and deliberation, we can carry the vote itself over to next Monday, February 14th, when we have a regular Board of Ed meeting. We will need to make a final decision and have a final vote by that meeting so that we are forwarding our budget to the Board of Finance in the timeline that they require. So again, for the viewing public, the proposed budget we are discussing and considering tonight was brought forth to us by Dr. Freeman last month at the beginning of January. It is posted on the Guilford Public Schools website. Each board member has had a budget book, so to speak, for some time to pore over, and are again focusing tonight on addressing that budget and considering what's in the budget, an opportunity to ask further questions of the administration about particular line items we may have questions about, an opportunity to consider where, if and where we think there may be opportunity to decrease this budget. And of course, always an opportunity if we think any particular line in the proposed draft is underfunded, and we'd like to consider that as well. I'd like to start tonight by giving my colleagues an opportunity to ask questions that you may have that would allow you or all of us as a group to be better informed as we deliberate on this budget. So I am going to open that up to my colleagues, and I see already, Moira, your hand raised, so please go right ahead.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, I would love the opportunity to dig a little deeper and have a better understanding of the mastery course for the high school and the 2.4 full-time, line item in the budget, just to really get a better understanding of how those staff members will be utilized, have a clear understanding of what this is going to look like on a day-to-day basis with the students. And also conversely understand if it isn't something that ends up in the budget, how do we still provide for that course, that required course?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm happy to begin answering that question, and then I will invite Ms. Chaff to join. So remember, this year we are only servicing the juniors who are enrolled in Guilford High School this year. So we're providing the courses. It's a half credit course. We're providing it essentially to half of the juniors in the first semester, that's just behind us, and the second half in the second semester. We've got approximately 1.2 staff members that are covering those classes that we offer this year. Next year, remember that we'll be covering the juniors again in year 2, covering the second half credit for their experience as they become seniors, and then again the junior class behind them. And so we would end up needing to double that FTE. The courses are half-year courses. They earn half a credit. They meet for 1 semester. In the course of the structure of the course is that as the juniors enter into the course this year, they first begin by revisiting those skills or those competencies that we expect from them before they graduate. At this time, those skills and competencies are being identified by the profile of the learner that the high school already has in place, adapted largely from the IB profile, but applied to all students at the high school. In the future, as we come to closure on our portrait of the graduate, that will be the target. Those will be the skills and competencies that we identify in the courses. And I expect that there's going to be a large degree of overlap from the portrait of the graduate that we compile district-wide in what we're currently expecting from high school seniors as they graduate. They identify those skills and those competencies, and then across their half of a year or their semester as juniors, they identify a series of small-scale projects or exhibits that they will create to show, to exhibit their competency, their mastery of those competencies in each of those areas. They do that collaborating with the students who are in the class with them, and under the supervision and guidance of the teacher who structures that time. So once each of those projects is identified, the time then becomes workshop time. It becomes time in which the students then have to actually work on the projects or the exhibits that they are creating. I have been asked, or I've heard the comment from some of the students who have gone through this first semester that it feels like a study hall. I would suggest that structurally it's more like an art studio or more like one of our tech ed classes where students are identifying projects and then they spend much of their time in the completion of those projects. It is correct that it's not a course in which new content is being delivered. It's a course in which they're looking back over the development of those skills and competencies and developing those exhibits, those projects. I would remind everybody that we have done this the first time for this half of the semester. We will be completing a second semester in the second half of this school year. We've just launched that second semester, and we'll take the learning from this first semester to revise the course moving forward. It's also worth noting that there are many high schools across the state of Connecticut that haven't begun this at all. They will be addressing this from whole cloth next year, completing the entire credit for all of their seniors. Our seniors next year will have half of the work behind them, and they'll simply have the second other half credit to complete. In that senior year, when the students move into that senior year, structure is similar, but importantly differentiated. In the senior year, what the students will be doing is, again, looking at those skills and competencies that they've been expected to master, looking back at their small exhibits, their small discrete exhibits from sophomore year, and then identifying one integrated or holistic project or exhibit that integrates the multiple competencies and skills that they have been expected to master. That project will then be shared. At the high school, there's an interesting effort that we're going to try to tie that second year's experience, that senior experience, to something in the community, something that would have value outside the walls of the high school. So you're taking those skills and you're applying them, but this would also give students an opportunity to tie their senior year project or thesis or exhibit to things like the community service hours that they're already required to complete. IB students have a CAST project, which takes them out of the school and into the community, and we would find an opportunity to integrate those exhibits as well. I think there has been a question about whether this exhibit can be tied into an existing course, like a senior year English or social studies course, and it can't. The mandate from the state is that it be a standalone single credit. Remember, the state is requiring that this performance-based exhibit of mastery is a standalone credit that the students have to achieve separate and apart from the other credits that they accrue during their time going through their 4 years at the high school. Mr. Chaff, did I get that generally correct? Is that a brief but clear, or I guess brief? I won't ask if it's clear. We'll ask everybody else if I answered the question.
No, I think that was quite clear, and I would only add that the course is not set in stone. So we plan to take feedback not only from the students who have participated in it already, but we'll do so again at the end of this semester and continue to refine it so that we want to maximize the experience for the student. That's the whole point of it. It's a reflection exercise. So you're looking back over the course of your 4 years and figuring out and deciding through those competencies how you've grown. I would only add one other piece, which is last week when we had our NEASC accreditation visitors. They were very complimentary of the structure and design of the course. They did receive some feedback that we may have been a little bit too prescriptive in the rollout of it. But with that feedback, I think that we can make it even better from the student experience side of things, and we plan to do so.
Ms. Rader, you did ask what would happen if we did not budget for the 2.4 FTEs. I apologize for missing that point. If we were not to create the course structure for it, then what would happen in essence is that the expectation would need to be scheduled as an independent study for students. It would become an expectation for something that they would complete outside of the school day. I would suggest that we would want to hold on to at least a portion of those budgeted dollars in an effort to provide a number of stipended opportunities for teachers who would monitor and supervise the independent study outside not only of the student schedule, but outside of their schedule as well. I do have some trepidation about that. If you recall, this year, we worked to offer an additional opportunity that was going to be scheduled on Saturdays, and we were not able to find staffing. I am worried to some degree about finding a sufficient number of staff members who would be willing to pick up the additional stipend and supervise the work outside of school. That has never been a concern before this year, and hopefully if next year returns to more normal pacing, it wouldn't be a challenge to find those staff members. I do want to reiterate, though, that a significant driver for us in designing this opportunity as occurring within the school day and within the school calendar is because we do have concerns about the load that this would place on students if it occurred outside of the school day and outside of their regular schedule. I do want to remind the board that it was 4 years ago that we had a community-wide conversation about the weight that homework was placing on students and the expectations that we had for students for completing work outside of the school day. We had a significant community conversation about stress and anxiety and depression. We have talked about the fact that attending a high-performing high school is now identified as a risk factor for students for anxiety and stress. I worry about taking an entire 1 credit graduation requirement and scheduling it as homework for students. And so while I know that this is creating forced choices, and I'm thrilled that students want to take courses from our catalog, we design the courses to be attractive, but in some degree we have designed this to protect students from themselves and to afford them the space and the time to do this and do it well without adding to the load of anxiety and stress that a junior and senior year can bring to high school students, particularly in communities like Guilford. I'm happy to take other questions. I know there's more.
Christy,
Can
go
I just
ahead.
ask yeah, sorry, it's gonna be loud. I set it in my living room to be closer to my family and I am regretting it. I just for clarification, so for these projects, there is the opportunity to work with other peers, but my understanding is as it's set up right now, it would only be if those peers happen to be in that same scheduled class, or can they collaborate independently?
You can absolutely collaborate independently cross-course. It would just be logistically easier to collaborate with the kids who had the same time in the schedule. So obviously those kids who are in the class with you are available to you in that immediate time, every time that course meets. That doesn't mean that students scheduled cross courses couldn't collaborate, but again, they'd be taking it outside of the school day, or they'd be doing it asynchronously. But I believe, Julia, that wouldn't be prohibited.
That's
Yeah,
correct.
I got a nod. Yep.
That's correct.
I guess my only piece, considering the alternative options that involve the stipend or involve it happening outside of school, I'm trying to think of a positive side to that. Potentially, it is that it's still creating a social opportunity for these kids where, they will be coming together, hopefully, and collaborating. So hopefully just that partnership could alleviate some of that pressure.
Yep.
Jennifer, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm just having a hard time. I've been getting feedback from families in the community who have current juniors, and it has not been very positive. And it could just be because it's new, right? Change is scary to everybody. But the general consensus is that it is a ton of work being placed on these children who are already having a hard time. So I'm also wondering, who's this targeted at? Because it definitely, with the plan that you guys have been telling us about, with all these big projects, it does not seem as if it is geared towards every student within the high school. And I'm just concerned about that if it is geared towards everybody in the high school, then I think it might be too much. And what are your thoughts on that?
So it is a graduation requirement. It will be an expectation of every student. I think Mrs. Chaff is right in that we need to learn from the experience and the feedback that we have received. So it is not unusual anytime we launch a course for the first time to realize that we may have overplanned, to realize that the expectations may need to be adjusted up or down. And I think all of that is work that will be done. And remember, we launched this year. This year became different than we thought it was going to be. So that's all good feedback. I know that Julia is collecting that feedback, but it's targeted for everybody who graduates. It will be a graduation requirement. Doesn't mean that it won't be differentiated. It can't be modified or adjusted. All of that will occur. And I think we need to learn through this first year of rollout. I was just going to be cautious to not confuse design with implementation, right? Every time we've designed something, we want to have a structure in place that makes sense. And then as we roll out the actual activities and we get the response from the first group who goes through, then we need to make those adjustments and we need to dial in. So I would be cautious not to confuse the design with the implementation. And often the feedback is about the implementation. Julia, were you looking to jump in on that too?
I was just going to say, Julia, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add to that we do have some students who are enrolled in a vocational education program at the high school, and they have been meeting their mastery-based diploma assessment requirements in relationship to that vocational experience. So I've worked very closely with Jackie Ham, who's the coordinator of special education at the high school, to make sure that every student in the high school is receiving a mastery-based diploma assessment experience. And so there are some modified versions of that do exist already in the high school, and we'll continue to monitor and adjust as needed to make sure that we are meeting the needs of every student.
Jason, I would think.
Sorry.
I
was
sorry.
just going to note, right, just a reminder, particularly for our viewing public, that this is a state required
Yes.
graduation requirement, right? So this every district in the state of Connecticut is having to incorporate this graduation requirement into their curriculum in some fashion. I just, in case anyone watching is not aware of the fact that there is a state mandate for this, as well as some parameters around what is expected. Sorry,
And then
Dr. Freeman,
no,
go ahead.
Well, no, and I'd also note, the idea about growing a course and growing this as, also remember nothing is carved in stone. And so, we may launch this program in the way that we're discussing it here tonight. And then I know that districts are going to be looking at the variations and the differences across the state, and people are going to borrow and steal and emulate what's happening in other districts. So, I know that particularly one of our NEASC visitors in specific talked about borrowing what he saw here in Guilford. But as next year unfolds, be assured that we will be looking at what other districts are doing. And if we see ways to adjust or modify what we've designed locally, we will. And if we see something that is wholly better, we can pull back and change. We've done that in all sorts of other opportunities across the board. Just because we approve something for one budget doesn't mean it is here in perpetuity.
Excellent. Other questions or comments on this topic? Not that we couldn't come back, but I don't want to, I know people may have questions on a number of budget issues, so I don't want to move on if people aren't ready. Go ahead, Arnold.
So considering the fact that this is a state mandated graduation requirement, I want to be clear too, the state has not provided any additional funding for this, correct? Okay.
Nope.
And is the idea that this mastery diploma requirement is going to be interdisciplinary in nature? And I'm asking that because if we do relegate it to being kind of coattailed or kind of like a writer on other disciplines, my concern is that it'll end up being focused more on that single class content rather than interdisciplinary. Am I headed in the right direction here mentally?
Yeah, very
Academically?
much so. Yes, it is very much expected to be an umbrella that covers all of their 13 years of experience. And so the way that we've done it, the way that we've attempted to design it is so that in the junior year, you're doing that discreetly, but individual small tests, but still across all of your experiences. And then in the senior year, in a way that is one sort of larger component that pulls all of those discrete pieces together. It also allows for students to individualize and these projects are not pre-designed and required. The students have a design responsibility in this as well. So absolutely, you're exactly right. If we did embed it in the social studies curricula, it could be harder for students to pull in a woodworking course or a metal shop or an art studio as part of their exhibit into all of that.
And just for the sake of the public, how many students will these 2.4 positions be supporting, this year and next year?
Is it roughly 500, Julia?
Yeah, I think we're at, this year we have 299 or 98 juniors who will then become seniors. And we have approximately, I want to say 270 upcoming rising juniors.
So actually closer to 600 in these first few years. So it'd be 600 students each taking a half-year course, supported by the 2.4 positions that we're suggesting.
Got it. Thank you.
Excellent. Go ahead, Dick.
I read the state requirements and they're both ambiguous on the one hand and quite clear on the other. The clarity is that they really are asking for, in old-fashioned terms, the equivalent, not just, but the equivalent of a serious capstone term paper or a serious capstone project. Project meaning it could be photography and music. It could be a lot of things, not just writing or some combination. But it's meant to be not simply feeding back what we've learned, a memory exercise, but rather an attempt to ask students to make some sense of all the essential things they've learned and do that in a way that is much higher level than probably anything they've been asked to do in any single course before this. That is, it's actually a very, very demanding high-level educational task. And so for me, it's an education question. How do we optimize the opportunity for students to rise above where they've been, in some sense, prepare them for the kind of thing that's going to be required of them after high school? To do that, I think it would be educationally irresponsible if we decide that the way to do this would be on the cheap and slough it off as independent studies. Some kids would get some really good help, other kids won't, but on average, it won't happen. There's just too much experience on other things. So if we're going to do it, we might as well do it right. And conceptually, I think we've started down that road. It's obviously not yet fully formulated, but we should at least figure out a structure and a way of doing it and funding that allows ourselves to grow into it so that we don't have an excuse of not doing it well within a year or two. And so the state has foisted this on us. I say let's make lemonade out of lemons, because we can turn this into a really honored exit requirement, as it were, in which students would feel pride and would have a final product, as it were, that they could, that in fact would be public in many ways, but most importantly would, I think, increase their own sense of competence.
Anybody else? Go ahead, Kristen.
Thank you. I'm wondering how kids pass. Like, who determines the criteria for actually earning the credit? Is it something that we as a district are creating the curriculum for this particular task, and therefore these 2.4 FTEs are going to actually pass a kid? Or is it a state set of requirements where a kid has to accomplish a certain number of criteria in order to earn this credit point? And I guess the reason why I'm asking is I'm just wondering how much flexibility we have with how we're rolling this out. So I don't know yet if I really appreciate what Dick said. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. But I also don't want to overkill kids who are feeling already overwhelmed. So I just want to understand a little bit more what the requirements from the state are, and who kind of grades or passes or fails this one credit for these kids.
So the state requires that we afford the credit, and then we grade or score that locally. So it is a local decision, right? The state requires that we do it, but the state requires credits in all sorts of areas, and we defer to all of our professional teachers to then assess and score that student work. Julia, do you want to speak more specifically about how this course is graded?
Yes, so we took a standards-based approach to the scoring, if you will. So the students do not receive a letter grade for their work. The teachers who are working on the course currently have devised rubrics that are based on the competencies that are in the current drafted learner profile, if you will, which will then become a more robust document after we finish the portrait of the graduate work. And it does not impact student GPA. So we wanted to accomplish multiple things. We wanted to carve out time and space for them to be able to do the work. It probably this year had the biggest impact on study hall enrollment. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to say that there aren't every year, scheduling issues that come up where hard choices have to be made. That does happen every year, and that may have occurred this year with this course as well. But we purposefully scheduled those classes into a study hall spot in student schedules. We did not force students to drop something that they did not want to drop. And then the teachers are working with the students on a progression rubric to show when they reach mastery. So the student can continue to input and change and alter the work, whether they're working alone or with a group, until they demonstrated that mastery level on the rubrics that the teachers are using. And then the grade that goes into the grade book is a pass grade, a P, for proficiency or mastery. So the students who, I think we had 116 students who are enrolled in the course in the fall. We had 8 students who did not complete the requirements for the course. They did not receive they did not receive a failing grade in quarter 1. They received an incomplete grade. And so we are rescheduling them into the course to finish the work, or in some cases they have an incomplete and they're working on finishing up that work on their own. I believe there were 8 of those students. So we had a 93% success rate with the students who are enrolled in the course. We also had about 22 students take it as an independent study. Out of those 22, I believe we had 4 of them who were able to complete the mastery level work within 1 semester. So we have a number of students who are continuing that independent study into semester 2. Did I answer the question completely, Kristen? If I missed something?
No, I think that's great. Thank you. So it doesn't affect a kid's GPA. If a kid does decide to take it outside of school, where you're saying only 4 passed in semester 1, they can just extend that for the rest of their, until they're done, right? So if they happen to finish end of February, then they get their pass at the end of February. Is that working okay? Like, do you think that the 18 kids who are still plugging away at this, like, is that by design? Like, are they basically saying, I didn't want to drop a specific class that I wanted to take, so I'm going to keep plugging away, and I don't care if it takes me 3/4 of a year to get this credit? Like, is this a viable option, I guess, is really what I'm asking. Or since we're looking at, you know, a 75% incompletion rate for the folks that did it outside of a class period, is it not a viable option? I'm really just trying to think through, if we've got kids, like I'm picturing, you know, a handful of kids who don't want to have a study hall, right? They wouldn't schedule a study hall. They would have themselves crammed full of everything else. I guess this is going to what Dr. Freeman said about saving the kids from themselves. So really, I'm just curious, if they say, I don't care if it takes me all year, I need to do it outside of school because my schedule is so crammed. Do you feel like that's at least a viable option?
I think 2 things happen. One is, usually what occurs is when something new starts to become old hat, you start to see an increased level of acceptance. And so I think this year there were students who were taken by surprise. I think this year there were students who had schedules and didn't want to alter them. I think that we didn't have anybody who had older siblings who had gone through it. So I think that you'll see those numbers come down. There are students in any given year who we may negotiate a schedule option and create a course for them that is an independent study. But I think we'll see those numbers decrease as we go through. It is ultimately a graduation requirement. All students must achieve the passing score before they may graduate. So I think that we will continue, again, in the way that we've designed it, to see small numbers of juniors who may not complete and then feel like I've got time to catch up. Obviously, the seniors who have it second semester are going to be up against a more real and concrete deadline, because they have to be able to exhibit, you know, their mastery, and they have to receive a passing grade on both half credits before they walk. Now, all of that being said, 2 things happen. The high school staff really bends over backwards to work with students who are up against completing requirements before that graduation day. We do everything we can to make sure that we afford all students that opportunity to have that experience. And occasionally we have students who don't complete all of those expectations before. Right? We've got lots of graduation requirements, 30 hours of community service time, certain numbers of credits, and all different boxes of maths and sciences and humanities. And so, you know, junior year, that starts to get real for students, and they start making sure that they're collecting all of the right components to be able to meet all of those expectations. And we have a really talented school counseling department and administration over there that makes sure they all collect those pieces. Julia, I don't know if we are planning on continuing to offer an independent study option, or if it might be the exception to the rule as we move forward, and it was bigger this year.
I guess my concern, and I don't think this is exactly an answer to your question, but my concern is if we open it up to independent study, what we don't have is the data of the number of students who aren't going to finish it at the end of this year, push it into the summer. And then we have seniors who haven't done the half credit as a junior, and they still need a half credit as a senior. That's what I'm trying to prevent. That's what the team at the high school is trying to prevent. but I don't know what those numbers will look like. So I'm reluctant to increase independent study based on the data that I have today.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Mhm.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for being here and providing kind of support for the discussion. Really appreciate it. I do want to make sure that that we make space for other discussions as well. I know I have a couple of budget questions. I'm not understanding entirely the lunch. These are going to come out all over the place, right? Because that's the way we've all been studying the books and landing in different places. I have a question about the lunch debt, which is a new thing that we haven't had in the budget. So I would love to hear a little explanation about that. And I imagine, so that's just one example. I imagine my colleagues may have other areas throughout this budget that we may have questions about. I am going to start with that, Dr. Freeman. Could you explain just the lunch debt, the approach that we need to take that's new this coming year, that's different than prior years?
Yes, I may need to ask Ms. Trudeau to help me with this, but essentially, the state has now said that school districts may not carry over existing lunch debt from one school year to another. We need to be able to write that debt off at the end of each school year. So in this budget, we had created a placeholder of $25,000. We know that every year we close the school year and there is existing debt that is out there. What we have done in the past is that we have carried that over and we have continued to expect that to be made up by families as they return year after year after year. And oftentimes in some cases, that debt is ultimately paid off senior year in order to clear the debt so that the student can then walk at graduation. The state is now saying that we can no longer carry that debt from year to year. We will have to write that debt off as a school system. And so we had built in a placeholder of $25,000 in the budget to be able to cover that number, which will be different year to year. It was a placeholder amount. Linda, did I essentially explain that correctly?
Oh, Linda, you went back on mute. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Yes, you did. The only thing I want to add is that the legislation also requires that the debt be paid by the Board of Education. It cannot be absorbed through the school lunch program. So
Okay.
even though the school lunch program is making money, we still have to cover that negative debt.
Okay.
Thank you. That's an
And
important.
again, this debt, as you alluded to, is debt that comes from student accounts for which lunches are charged, but funding is not sufficiently provided.
Yes, and actually that's another really important point. We will never deny a student lunch or breakfast at a school if they present themselves but don't have money to pay for that. And so, it is not unusual that students will come through the lunch line to buy a lunch, not have the money available to be able to pay for that lunch in the moment. We record that, we identify that as an expense to the account. We want our students to be fed and to be available for learning every day. We don't deny them access to food because they don't have the funds available. That's also a requirement for the state, but it's something that we would do anyway. Most times that debt is made up immediately, right? The student comes in the next day and pays for 2 lunches, but there are times where that balance grows or carries over, and we used to roll it over from year to year, and we may no longer do that.
So my final question then about this is that the amount that goes in that budget line is a prediction of what we think at the end of the academic year 22-23 will be the debt at that moment that the Board of Ed will need to cover.
Yes, and in fact,
Right.
we were going to touch on that comment later tonight. If you if later in this conversation the board asks or looks for recommendations from us in ways to make adjustments for the budget, this
Right.
is an item on that list, and I'll provide some specifics if we get to that conversation tonight.
Terrific. Okay. Jennifer, go ahead.
All right, just as a follow-up to that, because I know that right now they're getting the free lunches, right? But it's the second lunch and things that kids have to pay for. Is that correct? And so
Yes.
the debt
Yes.
that we're talking about is if this free lunch doesn't resume next year. Is that correct? Or
Go ahead, Linda.
No, currently there is some debt that carried over from prior to the pandemic. When the pandemic started, we stopped trying to collect some of this debt because we didn't think it was appropriate to start hounding people to pay, given the circumstances. So some of this has carried over from years prior. The
Nobody-
only ones that we actively tried to collect on were the seniors that graduated the last 2 years.
Nobody's accruing more debt this year because of the free lunches. And to be really clear, we provide a first lunch to any student who arrives without funds available. We don't provide a second lunch, and we don't allow a la carte purchases for students who don't have cash on hand. So we provide one lunch for any student, but nobody can buy snacks or desserts or extras if they don't have cash available. It's not a completely open kitchen.
So it sounds like both things are correct. Jennifer's point, which is when the free lunch rollout that has been in place during the pandemic is no longer a program, then that will also be a source of accrual, potential accrual of
Of new
student
debt,
debt.
yes.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we have
This was
existing-
a new thing that appeared this year, so it was helpful to have the explanation. Other questions? We have a large budget book in front of us, so my colleagues may have different line items or different issues they may have questions about. And then also, we have not yet had an opportunity to talk about the bonding. So there may be bonding issues. Go ahead, Noel.
Paul, can you walk us through the administrative increase of 8.29%?
Yes. And so that is actually specific only to the central office administration. That doesn't apply to the building level administration. And that's really a result of three different impacts. One is that we have slowly over years been building up the business manager position. That's Mrs. Trudeau's position. That position currently remains significantly underpaid when compared to other comparable positions outside of Guilford. The fact is, if Linda resigned tomorrow and we went out on the street, we'd need to make an immediate one-time adjustment to bring that salary up to a competitive level. Linda has been patient and has been allowing us to make adjustments to that position in increments. So she's seen increases more than the 2.25% that many other administrators and teachers saw this year. But we're taking small bites to grow that position to a point so that when Linda does retire, which will be at some finite point in time, this is not going to go on indefinitely, that we will have thank you, she's holding up 3 fingers, that we will have a position that would be competitive and that we would be able to go out and find a competitive replacement in that office. Another component to it is the raise that the board approved for me last school year, which also came in above that 2.25% that other groups were seeing. And then the third component was that a number of the contracts for the individuals who work at central office include stipends or additional pay. Those were not carried in this line. Those had previously been carried in other line items. We moved them this year into that line item to give an accurate representation of the complete compensation for the administrators who work out of central office. So that does create a one-time adjustment. And again, in this one-year budgeting cycle that we do, that contributed to that bump that you see this year as well.
Paul, I think
Linda,
he was
yep.
asking about school administration, not the central office certified.
Oh, I apologize. Linda, do you want to take that one? No, I didn't have my sheet open in front of me. I apologize.
So that one includes the proposed new position for the assistant elementary principal. It also has a correction to an annuity that the administrators receive in their contract for this current year. Their annuity was increased and it was not budgeted. and then it's increased again for next year. So there's a correction to the annuity payments for all the principals and administrators in that line.
If the assistant principal position does not continue in the budget, you'll see a correction to that line, and that percent would change with the removal of a whole position.
Thank you.
You got 2 questions answered for the price of 1 on that one. I apologize.
Go ahead, Moira.
Thanks, Katie. Regarding the bonding, I'd love to hear a little bit more, and maybe Cliff can speak to this a little. The 595 item and the bonding, the project to pretty much move central office to the one location at 595. Understanding the timeline of that, because understandably we'd be carrying 2 spaces for a while before, if the intention was to kind of bring everyone to a centralized location. Is there kind of a master idea of what that looks like?
Yeah, I'll start and then invite Cliff to jump in on that one. Currently the 3 positions that central office exists in right now, in none of those are we incurring costs. So we won't be adding any cost for swing space or a transition. Part of central office is housed in space off the back of LEAT. We have the technology department is housed in the back of LEAT, and there is a professional learning space that is housed in the back of LEAT. Part of central office is housed in what we call CO North on New England Road. That is business and special education and operations and transportation. All those functions are housed there, and the school district owns that space as well as the space at LEAT. And then the superintendent's office and the curricular office are housed here at Lathrop House on the green downtown. And while that is a town-owned property, the town does not charge the school district rent. And so we're in that space at no cost. This project, if we were to renovate the 595 space, we could fit all of those administrative functions in the space at 595. We would be under no time constraints to relocate the offices out of the existing space, because again, we're not accruing expenses for being in those spaces. So you might even see a staged move where we might move out of LEAT first and then move out of the CO North and then move out of late. We would have to work on what that scheduling looked like. The exciting part about this project to me is that if you think of the 595 and Lathrop House components, the town is holding 2 pieces of property as usable office space once the renovations are complete. But the space on the school property would be inappropriate for any use other than a school related use. We couldn't rent that space to somebody else and have them share parking space with the high school. We couldn't use that for a lot of other town functions because of the location. If we move out of Lathrop House on the green, the Lathrop House property then returns to the tax rolls and could have multiple uses or multiple opportunities for the town as a town-owned property in a historic home on the beautiful green. And so to me, that actually becomes one of the most exciting projects, as it affords an opportunity to the town, and most of the others don't provide that similar opportunity. Cliff, are you available to turn on your camera and add any more specifics to that? What I can say is that it will not compete with any school-based projects. We would not, summer tends to be a crunch time to get the school projects done so that we get the students back in time. This project wouldn't compete with any of them. Thanks, Cliff.
Can I add just before Cliff, one thing, just thinking about staging and coordinating and having like a construction project on campus while students are there. One of the issues that came up this year is parking. A very large junior class. And I know there are a lot of juniors and now new licensed sophomores that can't get a parking space on campus. There aren't any left. And this is down the road, but to think about, traffic impact or parking impact with bringing all of those staff and, ancillary people, and then also staging construction project that might impact parking and sports and circulation. And I'm sure you guys initially thought of that, but it just seems like it's not as simple as just, working on a building and moving people over. So Cliff could answer that as well.
Yeah, so the plan is to really sit down with Joel and with Julia and obviously Dr. Freeman and the contractor that we end up getting on board and coming up with a full plan on how we're going to be able to do construction. And I don't foresee us taking a lot of parking spots because you can have them park off-site or park down at CO North and then walk up with some of their vehicles. There will be a couple of containers that will have to be put on site. And again, those can be put into the grass so they're not taking up parking. So we come up with an overall plan on, how we'd accomplish, the construction and how to ensure that it minimally impacts, parking, the students, day-to-day safety, make sure that nobody, is affected or can get in there to the construction site and be, get hurt type of deal. So I think a lot of that plan will come out when we sit down with the contractor to hash it out.
Remember that currently parking is also being pinched by the existence of a tent in that parking lot. Ideally, this project would be able to align with the ability to remove the tent that is currently in that parking lot. And that would open up a significant number of spaces that were lost when we put the tent in that space. And
Dr.
there's
Freeman,
also the high.
Oh, go
sorry.
ahead. No, please go.
There's also the high probability as we look at the construction project to look at temporary parking. So actually create a construction parking lot, maybe in the grassy area somewhere on the site that's strictly used for just the contractors.
And Dr. Freeman, or Cliff, back when the new high school was built and this 595 building, which is kind of the old science wing, was retained, I think there was always a long-term vision of the potential for that building. Can you speak to that for a minute? I mean, it is my understanding that this is feeding into kind of a long-term vision of what that space could potentially provide for the school district itself.
And in fact, there was special legislation that was written. If the 595 had been if use of 595 had been discontinued for school purposes, or if it was demolished at the time of the new high school project, there would have been a penalty associated with it because of the timeline related to the state grants that were received for the construction of that property. The agreement was that it would always be used for town purposes. And there was always a suggestion that it could be for town offices. It just made sense down the road to recognize that the town holds Lathrop House and provides it at no cost to the school system for offices. To move other town offices into an office on school property made no sense. So it makes sense to move school-related offices into the property, the town property that sits on school property and shares the parking facilities with the schools, and then free up Lathrop House to be a completely freestanding resource that the town can do with what they will. But yes, and the other point is, if possible, that project would be scheduled over the summer as long as it doesn't compete with other projects. The securing of the grants, the securing of the bond rather, doesn't then dictate a timeline to us. The securing of the bond tells us we have the money in the bank and now we can build a timeline that makes the most sense. And Moira goes to all of the conflicts that you listed to make sure that we minimize those. This would be an unusual project in that it wouldn't have the rush that many of our other projects have of the pressure of the school year, right? We're not losing dollars by being where we are. It could in fact become a relatively leisurely project from Cliff's point of view, and that he doesn't have clocks ticking on him that he usually has on all of his other projects.
Thank you both.
I also want to note that there was a correction to that slide. And so I apologize, but the projects we had on the slide and in your budget books when we shared it with you originally, all of the projects were create, but the total amount on the bottom was not correct rather. And so I want to be clear that the tennis court renovations at the high school, the kitchen renovations at Baldwin, the library renovations at Cox, the district-wide pre-K playground and site work for the K through 4 playground at Lakes, And this 595 project that we've been discussing would create a total bond request of $3,885,391. That is the correct figure. You had an incorrect figure when I presented this to you at the first board meeting. Every individual project was correct. We just did not tally them correctly at the bottom of the page.
Okay, thank you for that. Dr. Freeman, since you just noted it, because I know one of the questions I asked early on that I believe ended up in the Q&A document was in fact about the district playground. As you just noted, the cost in the bonding accommodates the site prep work, et cetera, that might normally be in part of the operating budget for the district.
Yes, in all of the other 3 neighborhoods, the community raised money to purchase and install the equipment for the playground, and the district absorbed the cost of the site preparation, and that was absorbed from Cliff's site improvement line. And in this, because we were going to bond the equipment and the installation cost related to the pre-K and that site work, it made sense to bond all of the site work. And again, if we move to other opportunities later in the evening, I will be referencing that as well. That was a cost that was carried in our operational budget for the 3 other neighborhoods. And in this case, we have an opportunity to carry that cost in the bonding budget, the capital budget. And so I'll speak to that later if we're looking at recommendations for adjustments to the budget.
Right. All right. Thank you. Are there other questions? John, go ahead.
Dr. Freeman, unrelated to medical insurance, under purchase services, liability and property, as well as cyber liability insurance, can you speak specific to just why we need the cyber liability insurance, what it is, at whose recommendation, and then to the increase in the liability and property insurance?
Cyber liability is a new requirement. I can't remember if the town was required to carry it or if the school district specifically, but it's a new requirement that we carry that liability. Additionally, Mr. Mitchell has been working with an audit of our systems, and it was recommended that we carry that insurance additionally. So it's something we need to do moving forward, but it's something that we have been encouraged to do individually. There are school districts that have been hit with hacker attacks and ransomware attacks, and we need to make sure that we are insuring ourselves against that eventuality here. Linda, did you want to add or correct what I just said?
I just want to add to that while we are carrying the policy for the first time this year, unbudgeted, the recommendation that we have from our insurance consultant is that we needed to add a substantial increase to that policy cost, because there's not too many companies that are carrying that kind of policy for municipalities and boards of education. So it's about a 30% increase over what we're currently paying.
And I do remember this issue coming up 3 or 4 years ago when Bill Boss was chair, that this was something we really needed to start paying careful attention to, that there were real threats to our system and to districts across the state, not just us, right? That this was an issue that school boards and administrations were really being urged to attend to.
Municipalities more broadly.
I was just going to bring that up. Is it something that it's more a shared expense with the municipality, or is this on top of what the town is likely already doing?
I believe we carry separate policies. I'm sure they're doing something similar, but I believe that we carry our own policy.
And can you speak to what the consultant covers?
Yeah, we were looking to have Mr. Mitchell do a presentation more fully at an upcoming meeting, but the consultant was working both on in-house decisions that we could be making to sort of harden the systems, and then the insurance was another. You know, we're not just leaving ourselves vulnerable and buying the insurance. We're doing both. We're both hardening our own systems and purchasing the insurance as a backstop.
Dick, it looked like you had a question as well.
Well, I was going to comment that this is a decision, and this is an issue that we started several years ago.
Yep.
Which we agreed that we, along with the town, would jointly fund a consultant to ask whether or not we were adequately hardened against attacks. And if our technology was not up to snuff, we needed to know that now rather than later. And apparently, as part of that, we're getting the other recommendation that I don't know what we've got to do to upgrade our technology to be better, but clearly we're being recommended to get liability insurance. In essence, it's almost a stop loss policy on the medical side. You know, the town would be rightly in an uproar, citizens would be in an uproar if we ended up getting a ransomware attack and we hadn't done all that we should have done in preparation for the best protection we could have gotten, both technology as well as insurance. So this just seems like a cost of doing business in this day and age.
And we'll speak more specifically about those other decisions that have been made, but may want to do that under the cover of executive session for obvious reasons.
Mhm.
John, you may have had other questions. I want to let you continue.
No, that'd be helpful, because really what I was reading that budget line item as was, you know, insurance, not necessarily the proactive steps to prevent it, right? So, and that's all I was trying to lead to was, are we simply getting a policy, or are we actually doing something fundamentally different to protect ourselves against it?
It is both, and we appreciate the question, but the dollar amount listed for the policy is the insurance amount only.
Okay.
Any other questions? Oh, go ahead, Linda.
Well, I believe John asked about the increase in the liability and property insurance. So because we start our budget so early, we had talked to our insurance consultant that handles these policies. And his recommendation at the time was a substantial increase. We have since gone back and revised that number. And if we get to the point where we start talking about some possible reductions, we have a possible reduction to that number as things have gotten a little bit closer to where we actually get a renewal for these policies. We were able to refine those increases.
Great. And I'm being reminded also that our annual auditors recommended kind of addressing this cyber issue as well. So a number of reasons why it was important to address this issue.
This is it's a hot topic. Everybody's talking about it, and everybody was telling us that this is something that needs to get done.
Yeah, terrific. Kristen, did you have a question?
I do, on medical, which I'm hoping later in the night you're going to have some really good news for us on this particular topic. But I just had a couple of specific questions, not necessarily what are we going to do about it. 2 questions on just our summary sheet in the budget book. The first one is, what is food service? There's a food service line item under the medical insurance page, and I don't know what that is for, and it increased by $15,000. And then my second question is for employee contributions. The number is flat year over year at $2,664,000 for last year and for projected for this coming year. And I'm just curious about why that number doesn't sort of increase incrementally.
Linda, I'm going to toss both of those to you.
So the food service department has their insurance through their union. So it's not part of our plan. So there is a separate cost for theirs. And as staff has changed, we went from carrying a number of single policies to family policies, which have a bigger cost. So this is the projected cost for the current coverage that we have for the employees for the dining service program.
Gotcha. So it's not like hospital food that we're.
No.
It's our dining service employees, our dining services employees and their families.
Thank you.
Their insurance, medical insurance coverage. The other line is reimbursements that we get back from the employees for their co-pays, from retirees, from the state for the subsidies for retired teachers. The reason that the line is flat is because as staffing as things changed last year with staffing, I was actually off a little bit on my number. So what we actually received back in reimbursements was under that number. So while it is going up, that the premium cost share percentages are going up, I was a little hesitant to change it too much. Because we started the budget so early, I flat funded it because there were too many unknowns with the medical. So that's basically why the number's flat.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead, Moira.
I also want to make sure if there's anyone that hasn't asked a question yet. I'm just like you, Katie, I'm jumping to the next thing. Paul, I'm wondering if you can talk about, and then maybe Jason Scanziano, I'll put it in one question, you guys can jump in. One is about legal services, because I know sometimes that overlaps with our special ed service line, and then our tuition line. Just want to have some reassurance and understanding, because I know with legal, it's going up 87%. And then tuition, we're dropping it down by almost $100,000. So just would like to have a little more comfort level with those numbers. A little deeper explanation if possible. Thanks.
So those are both on a list for further discussion later tonight. The legal, legal covers us in a number of areas. The primary places that we track legal costs are in labor. And so we have 6 different labor groups that we work with. We negotiate contracts with them, generally on a 3-year cycle with each of the groups in a rolling cycle. And so there tends to be years where we have lots of negotiations and years where we may have fewer numbers. As we have moved through the pandemic and working conditions have been impacted, it has generated a lot of conversation and some negotiation with all of those departments as we have talked about how to make those adjustments. Things like the vaccination mandate for state and school district employees required us to consult with legal attorneys and get feedback on those components. There tends to be a significant amount that goes into that area. We then do work with an attorney, and there is often significant expense that's associated with special education. Sometimes the student profiles are complicated, the plans are involved. When they involve outside agencies or outside placements, we will often seek legal advice, or at times school attorneys will work with attorneys that the parents secure to make sure that we're doing everything right and meeting the needs of the students. We also at times work with legal to gain advice around matters of student discipline or around contractual matters. And then I've noted a number of times that in this past year or so, we have seen freedom of information requests that if they didn't triple, they at least doubled compared to what our normal experience had been. We receive freedom of information requests every year, but in this last year and a half, we've received a significant increase in the numbers that have come up. And so we often reach out to legal for support in those areas as well. The projection next year was based on what the actual spend was this year. It was significantly over what we had budgeted, and it was planning on having that same level of expense moving forward into next year. We have looked at that. That may be a little conservative if we take a slightly more optimistic view and assume that things are going to begin to trend back to normal. That may be a place that we might still need a significant increase of 20 or 25%, but maybe we don't need to come close to doubling that line to go forward next year. So that's a place that we can talk moving forward. The tuition line is always a projection. We look at the real students who we know we have enrolled now. We carry those students forward. Sometimes we have students who graduate or age out of the program. Other times we have students who move up a grade level. We budget for the real costs that we anticipate, that we know that we're going to have next year. And then we build in a level of contingency because every year there are students who have new and emerging needs, or new students either age into the system or move into Guilford and come into the system that way. The tuition line currently has a certain level of contingency built into it. And that contingency is something that we, again, can talk about later tonight. Do we feel that we need to hold all of the contingency that we have built into it now, or do we need to reduce that? Do we have the ability to reduce that contingency a little bit? You know that over the last 11 years, there's only been 2 years that we've come in on or under budget in tuition. We more often than not come in over budget on tuition, and then we make up those dollars elsewhere. Jason, the level of contingency that's built in at this moment and what might still be there if we make any reductions to that, I'll invite you to speak to.
Thank you, Paul. The only other thing that I would add to what Paul has already shared with you is that, as we know, this is an unpredictable line item in the sense that we are budgeting in October for events that may happen from October to July 1 of the following school year. And so we do our best to project and build in contingencies. I will share with the board that $100,000 is generally one student placement in an outplacement facility. Tuition ranges anywhere from on average $40,000 to $120,000. So it's an average projection of, really one student, give or take. With the number of students exiting next year who are reaching the maximum age of service, which was now changed in 2020 to the day before their 22nd birthday, with the number of students exiting and the number of students anticipating, that was where the projection came from.
Excellent. Thank you.
I will note that there have been conversations. I'm sorry, Katie.
No, go right ahead.
There's been a lot of conversation at the state level and at the legislative level about whether some of the historic shortfalls and excess cost may be addressed this year. So there could be really good news on the horizon about finally receiving most, if not all, of the excess cost that we would be due, rather than us budgeting to receive. We usually plan on receiving approximately 70% of what we should in that area. That is just conversation, that is speculation at this time, but it may mean that this would not be a bad year to assume slightly greater risk than we have over the last 3 or 4 years by thinking about that contingency that we build in, if we can anticipate or at least hope that there might be fuller reimbursement on the back end from the state. It's always a bit of a liability. We always make that decision. Again, what I want to make sure I state clearly is that regardless of how we budget and whether we hit that number or not, we always meet the needs of the students, even if it means coming in over budget in that line, and then we make up that shortfall in other areas to make sure it's never a debate about whether or not we provide service or not based on the number that we end up budgeting ultimately in this decision.
I'm gonna note I was in attendance at CABE's legislative breakfast that they hold every year in regions across the state. Guilford's region was up on Thursday morning and heard that same thing, right? That there is potentially a push this year at the legislative level to address the underfunding of this expenditure. And I know CABE is working pretty hard to support that this get addressed. I'm noting the time and want to pivot to start some discussions about budget considerations. That doesn't mean that there isn't an opportunity for additional questions, obviously, that my colleagues may have, but we do want to start for sure considering the budget that has been put in front of us, recognizing, as we do every year, that we try to look carefully at this budget, consider the educational and instructional components that really drive our work together and that are so important, understand those against considerations of town and citizen funding of our school system. Every year, Dr. Freeman, I know you have a chance after you propose your budget to do what each board member is kind of individually, at least to date, doing, which is kind of poring over it. Are there areas where we might be able to reconsider the line item a little bit, areas again that we want to either decrease or occasionally increase? So I know you have already tonight, as you've answered a number of questions, identified that you've been giving some thought to this. So I do want to give you an opportunity, if you would like, to share some of those thoughts, and then we as a board can start discussions as well.
I appreciate Dr. Balistracci. Thank you. I have taken the liberty to draft out some suggestions that I would like to share with the board. Most years, I point out areas where I think the budget may be adjusted in either direction. This year, while that obviously remains a board prerogative, my suggestions all tend in the direction of trying to bring down the 5.9. From the first time that I shared this with you in the transmittal letter that I included when I provided the budget to you for the first time, I noted that it was high, and I explained my rationale for why I felt it was necessary to bring these items forward and to at least begin advocating for some of these items. But I also noted that I recognize that sometimes goods need to be deferred. Sometimes investments require more than 1 year of requesting before they make it into the budget. I have learned with time and age that patience is a virtue. And so although I did put out the initial budget, and I believe that everything in that initial budget was responsible and justified and important, I also recognize that part of coming to a final budget involves priorities and compromise. And so I'm happy to share areas that we looked at as a way to begin that prioritization and compromising exercise. And obviously, there's a lot of blank lines on the table that I'm going to share because there may be other suggestions or ideas. And there may be areas where we do need to talk about increasing, although I am not teeing those up for the board right now. If it's okay with you, Dr. Balistracci, I'd be very happy just to share my screen and show you what I've got, and I'll try to briefly walk you through the whole list, and then come back to talk about specifics. So can the board see the table that I have just shared?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so what I'd like to do is note the dollar amounts in the left-handmost column. Those would be the amounts connected to the suggestions that I'd like to suggest. I can explain each of them briefly. And then what we have done in past years is if we actually get to the point of making decisions in each of those areas, I'd be happy to record real dollar amounts in the far right-hand column. So if you look at that first line item, the first line item is a proposed reduction to the current budget that sits in front of you of $84,000. That is related to the 2.4 teaching FTEs connected to the new mastery graduation requirement at GHS, but that is not an elimination of those 2.4 FTEs. That's a correction. We noted to you in the first night that we shared the budget that we had overestimated the cost of those. We had it listed at about $209,000. The actual cost of 2.4 FTEs would be $125,000. So that would be a reduction of $84,000 that we could take to the bottom line of this budget, and it would maintain the 2.4 FTEs in the design of the course that we had discussed at some length earlier tonight. The next line shows a reduction of $138,000. That is connected to the elimination of the assistant principal position at Lakes Elementary School. I continue to believe that it's important for us to begin discussing administrative staffing, particularly at the elementary level. But I recognize that with the overall level of this budget, that this year may not be the year to move this forward. If we hold off on that position this year, I assure you that I'll want to have more conversation about it next year, but we can hold on making that investment in the budget right now. Similarly, I would speak to the coaching position. I've said over and over again that we have grown in the last 12 years from 3 coaching positions to 12, but that hasn't been one position every year. There are good years to make that investment, and there are other years where that is a more difficult decision. I know that it would be good to move math coaching into the high school level. I know that broadening the support beyond simply literacy and math to a STEM approach would be beneficial. But again, that may be a place where we defer this request for 1 year. I can assure you that that request will come forward next year. I want to go slightly out of order on this one. I want to speak to the $63,000 social worker FTE. Currently, this position is already in the school system. This is a position that is already servicing the students of Guilford Public Schools. It is carried this year in the ESSER funding. The proposal was to move that position out of the ESSER funding and into the operational budget so that we were slowly weaning ourselves off of that grant funding rather than running up against the loss of it at one time. There are currently 3 teaching positions in the ESSER grant, 2 social work positions, and an English language teacher position. The idea was to reduce from 3 in the grant to only 2 in the grant this year. We can reduce that $63,000 from this year's budget, but continue to provide that service to our students by leaving that in the ESSER grant for 1 more year. This increases our liability next year when the grant sunsets, but there is some hope that we may be able to draw those funds further into, in fact, into a 4th school year. So again, that's a reduction to the budget, but it does not reduce service to students. It's different than the reduction of the coach and the principal because we'll still provide that service. Just above that, you see the special education position that we had requested this year. That is a classroom level special education teaching position. It is budgeted to fall half at Lakes Elementary School and half at Baldwin Middle School. Again, I would suggest that we remove that from the budget this year, but we could still provide the service to students next year if we move that cost into the ESSER grant rather than out of the ESSER grant. Now, I want to be clear what I've just recommended. My initial draft had us reducing 3 positions in the ESSER grant to only 2. This decision on top of the social work decision would increase 3 positions in the grant to 4. That will be a concern that we will have to address next year or the year after, or in both of those years if we have that opportunity. But I want to point out that while that is an opportunity this year, it's an opportunity to reduce the budget request and provide the service. It is an opportunity that we will have to account for in next year's budget or the budget after. Now, the hope is that we're not facing a medical increase of the magnitude that we're facing this year, and it becomes an easier year to absorb those positions into the operational budget. Those items, that list that I've run through so far, those items refer to that investment slide that I provided to you in my overview. On that investment slide, it included 6 bulleted investments. These adjustments to the budget accomplish 2 things. They reduce the cost of those 8 bullets to only 4, but they maintain the service to the students of 6 of those 8 bullets, right? It's important to note that we will be losing the investment, we will be losing the service of an assistant principal or a coach. We don't have it now, so we're not losing it, but we won't gain those next year. We will, however, continue to bring in the classroom teacher at Cox, the special education teacher at Baldwin and at Lakes, the continued service of the social worker. It does not say that we're not making any new investments in the district moving forward. 6 of the 8 bullets will still be providing service to our students moving forward. We looked further than just at that list of investments, however. So we spoke about legal earlier. Moira noted that legal was going up. We were projecting increasing legal by $74,000. It was approximately an 87% increase. We would reduce that by $50,000. We'll still be increasing that line by $24,000. It is still a significant increase, but we want to reduce that line by $50,000. We don't want to. We're suggesting it's a reasonable compromise. The site improvement line. This is the line that falls into Mr. Gurnham's area. This is the line that allows preventative maintenance and improvement to happen around the buildings. It provides for bathroom renovations. It provides for classroom renovations. It provides for the regular replacement of things like carpet and ceiling tile, so that we're replacing those items as they begin to age, and we don't wait for them to fail catastrophically before we replace them. That line in this budget was proposed to increase by $98,000. This is a suggestion that we decrease it by $200,000. So that means not only are we not moving forward, we're in fact moving back. We will be reducing the line from this current budget by $102,000 if we take this adjustment. Now, that's not a long-term good decision, but we have been doing well with that line overall. I think the last time that we made a reduction to it may have been in the 08-09 school year, where the referendum failed. We've been able to hold it flat or increase it over most of the last several years. This would be going backwards, but we would expect to begin the rebuilding again next year. And to the playground note or at least hint that I dropped earlier, in 3 of the last several years, we paid for the site improvement at the playground locations out of this site improvement line. Because this year we're able to carry that cost in the bonded amount, it means less that there will be projects that we won't be able to accomplish this year, because that's a cost that we won't be taking out of this line. What's more important is the step backwards in needing to begin rebuilding that line next year as we move forward. But we believe that that is a significant reduction that could help the overall bottom line of this budget. We spoke about tuition. We do have a significant contingency built into this tuition line at this time. We are suggesting that we could make a reduction of tuition by $100,000. Now, that could be any reduction. We could make it $50,000 or $75,000 or $25,000. But we are suggesting that we take on the liability of reducing that line this year, with the knowledge that if the costs exist, we will cover those costs. It may just mean that we overextend this line, as we have in 9 of the last 11 years, but also with the hope that if the state does come forward and really does meet their expectation under excess cost, which they have historically never done, but it is a good opportunity at the state level for that to occur this year, that this may not be the risk that it would be in another year. So again, that is a suggestion. Moira, I'm sorry, I do have to tell you, we spoke to Joe Spurgeon on Friday, and at this time, there is no more information on medical costs. Now, the hope continues to be that by the time this budget gets to the Board of Finance level, we may have some information back on the stop loss policy, and we may be able to have some adjustment, but there is no adjustment on the table at this time. It wouldn't be responsible to make a significant reduction there tonight or even next week. Please don't, we won't have significant more information by the time we meet on this again next week. So hopefully by the time it gets to the Board of Finance, but not now. There were some equipment requests. Most equipment requests that came through this year were not included in this budget. There were a couple of equipment requests that were included specifically at the high school and at Jones. We suggest deferring those for a year. Now, if there's an opportunity at the end of this budget year, if there are some unexpended dollars at the end of this calendar year, we may be able to make some of those investments in June, but we suggest reducing the equipment line, and this would fall specifically at the high school in Jones by a total of $15,000. We spoke about student debt earlier. We were carrying a line item of $25,000. We thought that that would be a reasonable number annually as we got back into the process of having some of those uncovered debts. But we're suggesting reducing that by $10,000 to $15,000. We noted that we're not incurring new debt this year. The current balance is around $13,000, so that's a reduction of $10,000. That makes sense. We may need to increase that next year if we go back to lunch sales and we start incurring more debt, but that is a reasonable adjustment at this time. We're suggesting reducing the overall district professional development line by $8,000. We're suggesting reducing the overall district textbook line by $8,000. Those are simply budget numbers. We will make a few forced choices. We may not get some books rebound this year that we would like to have rebound. It doesn't mean that we will withhold a course. It doesn't mean that we won't make the investments that need to be made, but we'll be a little more frugal in that area. And then, as Mrs. Trudeau hinted at earlier, we did go back and improve the numbers on the, Linda, please remind me, what does LAP stand for?
Liability, auto, and property insurance.
There you go. So liability, auto, property insurance, as well as the workers' compensation, we are confident at this time that we can reduce that line by $18,000. I know that there will be conversation on most, if not all of these, but just to give you a scale, if we adopted this list as presented, that would create a reduction of $844,000 over what I brought forward to you initially. It would maintain the design of the graduation course with the 2.4 FTEs as we have discussed. It would maintain the social work position. It would maintain the special ed position. It would maintain the classroom position at Cox. It would defer or eliminate investment in the assistant principal or the coaching position this year, but it does not take steps backwards either in the coaching support or the administrative support that we offer in the school system. It does invite some risk in the tuition line, but again, that is only to the way that we budget. It will not impact services that we provide to students. And it may be a step backwards in the site improvement line, but again, we've done really well over the last 7 or 8 years, and it is something that we can make up in other years where we don't have these pressures on the budget. A reduction of this magnitude, I believe, would bring the percent increase from the 5.9 that we stand at this moment to a 4.54% increase over where we are this year. And I appreciate the board entertaining those suggestions. I know that's not a final list, but those are my recommendations for places where we can have more discussion and at least get started. And there's a bunch of blank lines there for other ideas that we, the leadership team, may not have landed on so far.
Thank you, Dr. Freeman. Very helpful, and you've given us a lot of food for thought. I do just want to note for my colleagues just a couple other figures as we're thinking about all this. Per my read of the budget, we've noted this in past budget discussions, about 80% of our budget of the Board of Ed budget is made of salary and benefits. And so often we're looking at kind of the other 20%. Now, of course, included in that other 20% are things like heat and electricity and, snow removal, et cetera. Again, per my calculation, the budget has a salary increase of 1.57% and a benefits increase that includes the significant increase in medical benefits, which we have not experienced for many, many years, of about 2.61%. So those two things alone represent a 4.18%. I'm just for a second coming at it from the other direction so that people understand that unless we were to consider cutting existing staff, believe me, I'm not proposing that. I'm just naming that we're at a much higher base this year than we have been, quite frankly, in any of my 10 years on the Board of Education. So again, Dr. Freeman has just listed a number of areas that we and the board could consider as we think about ways to look at this draft budget, consider ways. I think we often try to see if we can't decrease again, particularly with a 5.9% starting point. I think many of us are interested in trying to find at least some areas. And so I certainly open it up to the floor if any of my colleagues have thoughts on what Dr. Freeman has shared, areas we might want to start talking about, other areas that anyone wanted to add to that list that that had not been put there by Dr. Freeman. Go ahead, Kristen.
Thanks, Katie. Do we have any sense, Dr. Freeman, you alluded to it, as we're thinking about potentially reducing something like capital improvements, do we have any sense of how stable our medical is going to be a year from now? Like, can we say, okay, we're now jumping up to such a level that next year the increase shouldn't look like this? Or do we have any visibility to kind of like, are we correcting and then we should maintain at a corrected level for a few years? Or are we potentially looking at a number or a percentage that can increase just as astronomically next year?
I think that we do not have that kind of predictability in insurance. I think insurance has been predictable, relatively predictable for us for a number of years, but insurance it's always going to be in response to the actual experience of our employees. And because we are self-insured and we're a relatively small number, then that can be volatile. I believe that if Anthem and other companies who specialize or at least service the municipal areas adopt this lasering approach to the stop loss, that will increase the volatility of this line. And so I think I said in one of the earlier meetings that if the lasering becomes standard practice for organizations or for bodies of our size, then I think that the insurance costs could become as volatile as the special education line, because you're looking at numbers that can swing pretty wildly based on 1 year's experience or one really expensive case that comes through. We are in a good place because of the surplus that we have built up. I do think it's worth noting that about 10 years ago, that line was $700 in the red. It is currently, I believe, between $5 and $6 million in the black. We have done really well managing that in collaboration with the town over these last 10, 11 years. But I'm concerned about that number moving forward. I am concerned about volatility in that number. The state has tried to control that with the state plan. We have looked at that in the past. It has not looked like it would be like it would work for us, but possibly if there's thoughts about moving forward and getting all municipalities or all school districts into a state plan, then that increases the number, and with growing size, you get more predictability. But we will make decisions about that around what works best for us locally. We're not going to make a decision that costs Guilford an exorbitant amount of money because it would be good overall. If we had a time machine, we might go back and do things differently, but I have not perfected mine.
All right, thank you.
I'm not in a rush though, because it's a time machine, so.
So, I'm going to note that that Dr. Freeman proposed a couple of things that we might want to consider. And again, any of my colleagues may have other ideas. There's the possibility of deferring things like consideration of an additional assistant principal at the elementary level, and deferring consideration of the proposed STEM coach. So those are things we may want to discuss. There's consideration of how we think about the positions that, particularly the social work positions that are in the ESSER grant, right? So we're not talking about, or the proposal certainly isn't talking about removing the positions, but really thinking about how we plan ahead for when that ESSER grant no longer exists. So another thing that we as a board want to think about strategically, how do we want to consider those positions? How do we want to think about using ESSER grant funds now and into the future? How we want to plan for when that ESSER grant, those ESSER grant funds are no longer available. There's obviously a proposal here for some deductions to a site improvement line, a legal line, tuition line, and smaller reductions to other lines. Again, so these are some of the proposals from Dr. Freeman of things that we can consider. Dick, go ahead.
Paul, this is really a thoughtful strategy, and looks to me like the big items that you wish to defer add up to somewhere between $300,000 and $450,000, depending on what we count. But I'm looking at site improvement, the social work position, the special ed position, the coach position, and the assistant principal position. If it's around $400,000, my view is that they were put forth for good reason. That is the good educational reason, and that we either need them whether we need them right now or later, they are worthy, they have some value that we want to worry about. Now, I like the idea that you've been able to defer them without us losing the services. But what it does is it defers almost a guaranteed additional $400,000 to next year's budget, to the following year's budget. And I just want to make sure we understand the order of magnitude of the debt in some sense that we're putting forward, so that if we do it, we sort of know that we're creating this debt and we got to pay for it later, because you can't keep scrimping on site improvement, for example. You really don't want to, we're not going to get rid of a special ed position, and we need the social work position. So I would say that if we cut these now, because you've presented operationally a way to get away with it, that we're committing ourselves in some sense to acknowledging that we have an obligation to pick them up, barring some renewed understanding in the following budget. So we're not surprised, but we know what we're doing, and we're taking some calculated risks.
That's exactly right. That was the rationale that we brought to these suggestions. Now, to put that in context, last year the medical line went down by $80,000. This year it's going up by 1.4 million. Next year, if medical is flat or does in fact trend backwards a little bit, a $400,000 investment is less than 1%. Right. It's about 0.75%. Right. If this were a different year, that would not be a huge item to wrestle with. And so that's exactly right. And there were two pieces of logic that we brought to this. That was one: what could we defer, knowing that we're sort of to some degree kicking it down the road, and the decisions that we make do insulate direct service to the students. Now, I say that really carefully, because teachers provide direct service to students, but administrators and coaches provide direct service and support to teachers, and people don't do a good job without support. But these forced compromises this year do not fall on class size. They do not fall on direct student service. They fall into those infrastructure items. And you're exactly right. To me, a coach and an administrator are every bit as important infrastructure as the site improvement line is. And you can get away with 1 or 2 years on scrimping on infrastructure, but when those bills begin to come due, they come due in a bigger way. And so I appreciate you drawing attention to the way these decisions are being made and what it means for next year's conversation and the year after.
I just want to remind us, as well as the public, that we would be knowingly and purposefully deferring somewhere between 0.5% and 0.75% that we immediately start out with next year, and that we don't forget it, so that people start questioning it all over again, like, where did it come from? Well, it's there and it's real, and let the let the notes show that we're purposely doing that if we do it, knowing what we're getting into. And I think that that would be a safe thing to do.
You know,
We won't allow you to forget it.
and you know, to state the obvious, right? We can approach that in a number of ways. We can consider what Dr. Freeman has put in front of us. We can say, you know what, we as a board appreciate perhaps maintaining a position in the ESSER grant, but would choose not to add the special education position onto that, but fund it in whole, right? So find a compromise so that, Dick, we're not deferring quite
Yeah,
that much,
right, I agree.
to next year. We
That's where
might
we are
choose,
now.
right, you know, we might choose, I must say, in my individual perusal of the budget book and my own kind of starting list, I looked at the site improvement line and thought, what if we flatline it? So it wouldn't, you know, in my kind of the back of the envelope or my draft Excel spreadsheet, I was looking at reducing that line by 98,000 rather than the 200,000 that Dr. Freeman is suggesting here. So clearly, right, there are a number of ways we can approach this. We may agree or not agree wholeheartedly with entire lines here, et cetera. So this is really an opportunity to start talking about and thinking about these things. As I noticed at the beginning of this meeting, or noted at the beginning of this meeting, I don't expect us to probably be voting on this. There's a lot to think about voting on this tonight.
Right.
So we have an opportunity to start thinking and talking tonight, and continuing and finalizing these conversations at our Board of Ed meeting on February 14th. And so I would suggest we take some opportunity to have some discussions about some of these items if people are ready, but also understand that individual board members may want some time to kind of think about these and kind of absorb them and give them some thought. So again, just opening it up to discussion about items that people feel comfortable about discussing at this point. Jennifer, go ahead.
Thank you. I kind of have two pieces. One with the legal, has there ever been any discussion about having a staff attorney rather than a contracted attorney so that you have a set finite salary versus the fluctuation and volatility that we're having now? I guess I'll ask that first and then.
Not really. And I think one of the things that has held us back is that I don't know that the amount that we budget now would be attractive as a salary. And I don't know if, you know, I guess may not bring somebody in full-time exclusively, but the other piece is that we actually parcel our legal work out to firms or individuals who have areas of expertise. And so we don't use our legal advisor, we don't use our labor advisor for special education questions because he's not expert or specialized in that area. And so by breaking it up, it sort of allows us to play to individual strengths and areas of expertise. I do know that larger school districts do have in-house counsel. And so no, it's not something that we've taken on specifically.
And that's a great answer. And that's exactly why you don't have a staff attorney, right? So
yep.
I just had to ask that. In terms of the budget, I think you've done a great job when you take out medical and salary and you look at just what you've proposed. And I have done it line by line. I know we all have, we've caucused. And it makes sense. Like it makes sense how it increases and whatnot. Overall, I gotta say that I'm all for any budget that puts teachers, paras, special ed teachers in the classrooms. I really don't like adding admin, especially in this year. Everybody's hurting. Some people aren't even back to work. You know, you guys have talked about how we've been down about 10 teachers. I look at the salaries for the coach and for the principal, that's $240,000. That's 4 teachers and at least 1 or 2 paras. And so if we're going to keep the numbers, I'd rather put it towards people and actual people working directly with the students. I understand your position about the coaches, but I just don't think this is the time for that. All for obviously special ed. I get real nervous when you guys talk about reducing the tuition for special ed, just because that is, again, a volatile line. But those are my comments. I hope that was clear. It's my first time.
No,
It was very clear, and it aligns with, the suggestions that we're making. So I appreciate that support.
others? Moira, do you have your hand up? Okay, sorry, it's hard to tell.
Katie, do you want me to? I always get caught up in Zoom meetings right at this moment. We can keep the screen share up so everybody can keep looking at the table, but then we can't see all of each other. Should I drop?
And I was having trouble seeing Moira's hand behind her name script at the bottom of the box. I defer to my colleagues. Either way is fine. I'm happy to take it down unless it's useful as a continuing consultation tool.
Well, that's the only reason I did this way is because I wanted to give others, I can't see everyone, so I don't want to interrupt if somebody else wants to jump in first. To circle back to the mastery piece, it's nice that we have this correction. I'm curious, Paul, do you see that, and this is the crystal ball question, but do you see that program growing and needing more support? When you talk about 500-600 students and 2.4 staff members managing that, do you think that's a logical line, that if we support that's going to carry this program and the needs it has? Or are we going to be seeing this again next year where you're like, you know what, and you can't predict that, but I'm just curious. And, and then while I'm speaking, I kind of agree with Jen's approach that this probably is not the year to be going admin heavy and adding an assistant principal, although I can see where that need definitely can happen in a school the size of Lakes and with the special ed program there, the preschool program. But if there is a line that we could think about forestalling for a year or so until we get our legs steady again post-COVID, I think that would be valuable. But I'm just curious if you think that that's going to be something you're going to ask for again next year, the mastery staff.
No, I don't see the FT needs increasing, because I think that the class sizes remain relatively stable all the way back through elementary at this time. And you're in fact looking at 2 of the largest classes that we have coming through. And so, no, I don't see that it would, as long as it remains a 1 credit requirement, I don't see that we would need to be growing. And I saw that Julia turned her camera back on and was nodding as well. I don't anticipate, unless we come back and redesign it, that you're going to see that need increasing in time.
Go ahead, Dick.
For our new board members, I think it's been the case every year for the last 4 or 5 years that no matter what we decide tonight or next week, the finance board will still request from us some considerable amount of reduction. They can't tell us what to reduce. So if we were to take everything that Paul, for example, was suggesting, we just took it literally and chopped off $800 and something thousand, they could come in and say, we'll take another $100,000 off. And so I believe on principle, that's what finance boards do. They got to show why they're finance boards. And so if that's the case, then all the more reason I would not want to make the decision tonight, and would want to think more about how we treat these items in light of the fact that we're going to be cutting more than we're cutting tonight at some point.
And I'll just add that I appreciate that comment, in that over the totality of my experience in Connecticut, that's exactly true. I will note, however, that I think in roughly half of the years that I've been involved in bringing budgets forward to the Board of Finance, they have not made any adjustment. And so this is a tough year. This is a big budget. It's likely this might not be one of those years, but two pieces. We worked really hard to get to the list that's in front of you tonight. That is, it's accurate that if you take that full 844 and then the Board of Finance asks for another $250,000, or doesn't ask, but the Board of Finance reduces by another $250,000, that will be difficult. And so, you know, there are some lines on there. Tuition we might choose to reduce, but not by a full 100. Site improvement we might choose to reduce, but not by a full 200,000, and that could leave then some room. And there's a question mark on there. We're still hopeful that we get good news about medical, but it would have to, one, be good news, and two, it would still have to be here before the Board of Finance is scheduled to take action if that's going to absorb any of those changes. So those are all good points to keep in mind.
Plus, the grand list has increased considerably, and it may be that with luck, there will be enough new income to the town that they won't feel as much pressure as they normally would have, except this medical thing is probably negating that. But it will be interesting to spend this week thinking about how much of what you've recommended we should accept.
Yeah, our budget is limited in that we really only address the expense of running the school system. Before this becomes a mill increase for anybody in this town, it gets combined with the town side, and then it gets combined with revenue. And so even though, right, 4.5 or 5.9 or any number in between is high for us, if that's offset by a positive year with revenue at the town level, it doesn't necessarily become a mill increase. That might be, you know, as big as another year where we had a really small increase, but revenue was suffering. So that is a very important point to make. And again, it's part of the limitation of the way we do budgets. We do them 1 year at a time. We essentially look at cost only, and it looks, you know, 5.9% looks terrible, but that's not offset with any revenues, or with very small revenues, because we're responsible for very small numbers when it comes to revenue.
Other thoughts as part of a conversation this evening? Go ahead, Chrissy.
I'm just going to run down the list in my head. So, you know, with regard to the mastery course, I think my concern is just that your proposal currently that you've offered reflects the decrease only based on the original thing that, so you're still asking for the full 2.4. And my concern is just that all the feedback that we're getting, you know, I know it's probably it's hard to tell whether it's just parents and students overwhelmed by this completely brand new thing and not necessarily the way it's being implemented. But it's hard not to also feel a little bit of that. Like there might be room for pause to reconsider and reevaluate how it's being done. You know, you did mention the stipend. So I'm just wondering if there's any way for us to get a better sense of what that might look like. You know, if that was a consideration. I don't know if that would be an immense amount of work to get to us by next week, but
no, I can give you that now. So we also ran out the idea of eliminating the FTEs completely, providing approximately 10 teacher FTEs, 10 teacher stipends of $5,000 a piece. That would save an additional $75,000 from where we are now. I would suggest, however, that the idea of pulling back and doing it that way and then trying to ramp up would be, I think that would be less strategic than trying to design it in the best way possible and making the investment now and then pulling back if necessary. And again, I understand the feedback, but I also know that new mandates are rarely popular in the first go round. So remember, we've done it half of one time so far. And so I understand that. We could reduce this line by another 75,000. That would maintain 50,000 for those 10 stipends, right? And then you'd be having those teachers servicing those 600 students, helping them to monitor their after school independent studies and be sure that they were making their timelines and getting that work completed on time. I did mention my caution earlier about whether or not we'd be able to attract 10 people who were interested in doing that additional work for that compensation. But that would be, the 84,000 reduces it from the 209 to the 125. Another $75,000 reduction would bring it down to a cost of $50,000 to pay for the expense through stipends only.
And simple math here. I mean, that's 60 students per teacher.
Yes.
That's a large load. If you
Yeah.
ask me.
Well, but again, right? If we said that we wanted to do 20 stipends instead of 10 stipends, now they're dealing with now the savings is beginning to crunch. 75,000 now is only a savings of 37,000. You start to get to a point of diminishing return. And so yes,
that was my point entirely. Sorry if that came across as a critical. It was a stating out loud what the alternative might look like for a staff who takes on a $5,000 stipend and takes on 60 students in a given year to try.
So would it be
support.
30 and 30? Yeah, it would be split, right?
If student, yes, right, yes. If students are able to complete it in a semester, what we're hearing initially is that when it becomes an independent project, very early evidence suggests it's harder to complete in that period of time. So I just want to name what we're looking at when these other considerations come up, and what needs to be considered.
So if we went with the stipend independent study model, we might be able to reduce further by somewhere between 30 and 75,000 more, depending on what we were expected teachers to carry for that compensation.
So there's been no exploration though, like among teachers to see if that's something they would be interested in.
No, we have not polled the staff yet to see if
Okay.
there would be that level of interest. Nope.
Because that could, make it all a moot point. And then, in terms of, to echo what other people have said, I also agree that at this point, the assistant principal, while I can see the need in the future, it's just not the year for it. The STEM coach, I'm a scientist, but, again, it's not the year for it. My only concern though is just, I understand that this came out of concern expressed by a lot of parents. So is there a way that wouldn't impact the budget to at least, is there a plan to kind of reevaluate or provide some professional development that might already be budgeted, or, just continue this discussion so it doesn't just stop right now at this no, but I mean, is that in the discussion at least?
I'm sorry, which concern raised by parents about science at the elementary level or at Baldwin? I think that we're happy to continue. Obviously, we're going to continue to do the work. I do think that some of the concerns that have been raised have been answered. I think some of them are misunderstandings about some of the decisions or some of the processes that have been put in place. I want to be abundantly clear. We do teach science and social studies at the elementary level. We meet all of the state expectations for instruction at that level. And in fact, in the new science standardized testing that is done, it's only been done for a year or two now, we actually perform really well. And so yes, we will continue to support teachers in that work. We've been working with the Center for Assessment on Science Instruction and Assessment for the last several years. We will continue to do all of that with or without a coach this year. Absolutely.
Yeah, I know, just like a tidbit, we don't have time for me to be sharing personal, but I know at Guilford Lakes, there was an incredible program, completely parent run. I think it was a retired teacher taught the parents how to teach the lessons, and they came into the classrooms. And I think once COVID hit, that was done. But, that hopefully there are considerations for programs like that to kind of reconvene eventually.
Absolutely. I think you're talking about Mr. P. Yes. And he did a great job. Yep.
And then just to echo Dick's point about the special education and the social work, I guess you and I believe Mr. Scanziano mentioned at the district leadership meeting originally that the special ed program has actually grown during COVID. While we've seen some numbers change one direction, we have seen an increase in students at Lake. So I just do have a concern that there clearly is a very big need for this position. So I just am in support of it. I'm looking forward to discussing it more with my colleagues, but whether it's this year or next year, it appears that, you know, there is a significant need for both of these positions. I think that's it for my list.
There's a piece of me that's really pleased with us for what we are suggesting around the social worker and the special ed teacher, right? It's a way to have it now and not have it impact this year's budget. There's another piece of me, and I think it's a larger piece, that is nervous about the way we're making this decision. And so I just want to be clear. We recognize that we're kicking the can down the road. I guess the best way to frame that is to say, were it not for the federal support that has come to us in the form of ESSER grants, we would not have the opportunity to make this decision. So we're using those dollars in the best way intended. Grants just always make me nervous because they're not permanent. And it does mean it tees up a decision for us to make in the future, just as Dick, laid out for us all. But it's a good response for tonight, and it's a good response for this year. And then we'll work on it moving forward.
Any last comments from colleagues, thoughts, or do people want to kind of absorb what they've heard, compare it to whatever kind of individual back of the envelope list they had themselves, and then bring this discussion back to our board meeting next Monday? It will be a regular board meeting, so we will have the other things that we usually have at a regular board meeting, everything from reports on financials to student representatives to a superintendent's report. But again, have the opportunity to certainly put this on the agenda to continue talking and come to a determination of final decisions. So
that being said, we'll keep the rest of the agenda light. We won't have any other really big discussion items on the agenda. I'll keep my report to a minimum, and we'll try not to have any other big debatable decisions on the agenda. There will be some regular course of business stuff that we do have to get through. That's exactly right. Yep.
So just looking to see if any of my colleagues have any more comments or thoughts for this evening, to give people that opportunity. And if I don't see that, we could certainly come to a close for this evening.
Katie, if I could just add that I really appreciate the quality of the conversation through the written questions you've all been submitting and tonight in the last few meetings. Please know that I'm acutely aware of what a difficult budget I handed to all of you. I know that it's not easy to make these kinds of forced choices. I really do appreciate the time and the thoughtfulness that you've all been putting into this.
Thank you. All right, I'm not seeing any additional hands raised. So I'm going to thank my colleagues for, again, the discussion tonight. We have a lot to think about before next Monday, and then we will reconvene and hold a discussion. If in the meantime, as we have been doing all along, if additional questions come to mind, please send them my way. I will forward them to Linda and to Paul. And then we can get answers that help us with our thinking. So may I have a motion to adjourn the meeting for this evening?
So moved.
A second?
Aye.
Okay, thank you. All in favor? Aye. Wonderful. Okay, so the meeting is adjourned. Good night, everyone. I hope you have a good rest of your evening. Thank you, Cliff, Julia, Jason, Linda, Jason, for being with us tonight. Really helpful to have you here because clearly we needed each of you for some questions.
and all of the other principals and administrators that I know are on YouTube. That gives them an opportunity to watch and not be asked questions, but I know a lot of them are there, and I appreciate everybody who stayed up for this tonight. Thank you all.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you. Good night, everybody.